Hashtag the Korean Mafia boss could command death, but he couldn't save his silent son. The security alarm didn't go off. That was Leo Kangdae's first mistake. Assuming silence in a fortress meant safety. His second mistake was thinking his 6-year-old son was mute. Leo's hand instinctively moved to the Beretta holstered beneath his Armani suit as he approached CNU's playroom. Silence in his world meant two things: submission or ambush. He'd orchestrated 14 territorial executions across 3 continents this month alone, and his Russian partners were getting ambitious. Silence was never innocent. But what stopped him cold wasn't the silence. It was the laughter. High-pitched. Genuine. Impossible. Through the barely cracked door, Leo watched his son, the boy who hadn't spoken a single word in 2 years, the child who stared through him like he was a ghost, sitting cross-legged on the carpet. CNU was talking. Actually talking. Complete sentences tumbling out in rapid Korean, his small hands animated, his face lit up with joy Leo had forgotten existed. And then the dragon flew over the mountain, Miss Park. Can you believe it? He was so brave. The housekeeper, a 60-year-old woman Leo paid $200,000 a year specifically because she asked no questions, was folding laundry. She smiled at the boy with the kind of warmth that made Leo's chest constrict. "You're braver than any dragon, sweet boy," she said softly. Leo's back hit the marble wall. The phone in his pocket buzzed, probably his Hong Kong operation confirming another billion-dollar deal. He ignored it. For the first time in his criminal career, Leo Kangdae stood paralyzed, not by a rival's gun, but by his son's voice. 2 years. 24 months of medical specialists flown in from Switzerland, Russia, and Johns Hopkins. Neurologists who'd examined CNU with million-dollar equipment. Speech therapists who'd worked with him daily. All of them had said the same thing: selective mutism triggered by trauma. He physically can speak. He's choosing not to. Leo had spent $4.3 million trying to fix his son's silence. Funny how he could calculate the exact amount down to the last bribe and specialist fee, but couldn't remember the last time he'd actually sat on the floor and played with the boy. Too busy building an empire. Too busy being untouchable. "Miss Park." CNU's voice dropped to a whisper. "Can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, darling. I had a dream about Mommy again last night." Leo's blood turned to ice. She was crying. Papa was there too, but he was angry. Really, really angry. The boy's voice wavered. Papa said a word. He said, "necessary." The housekeeper's hands froze mid-fold. And then Mommy went away forever. Leo stumbled backward, his $3,000 Italian shoes silent on the marble he'd imported from Carrara specifically because it reminded him of his late wife. The woman whose car accident 2 years ago had been anything but accidental. The woman whose testimony would have destroyed everything he'd built. The woman his son had apparently been awake to hear him eliminate. His son wasn't mute from grief. He was mute from knowledge. And somewhere in Moscow, Dmitri's men were already moving. The question that will shatter everything: what do you do when the only person you're trying to protect knows you're the monster? Hashtag Chapter 1. The King of Whispers. 48 hours earlier, Leo Kangdae had made a man disappear over a conference call while eating breakfast. The man's name was Chin Wei-lin, a Hong Kong gambling syndicate operator who'd skimmed $2.3 million from their joint football match-fixing operation. Leo had been spreading imported Italian butter on sourdough toast when he'd given the order. 3 words in Korean: make it educational. Educational meant the body would be found. Educational meant Chen's partners would understand the cost of disloyalty. Educational meant Leo didn't even need to raise his voice. He'd finished his toast before Chen stopped screaming on the other end of the line. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, Leo's phone had buzzed with confirmations from Seoul, Macau, and Moscow. Territory secured. Debts collected. Rivals neutralized. His empire stretched across 3 continents like a spider's web, and he sat at the center, feeling every tremor, controlling every thread. Presidents returned his calls within the hour. Police commissioners looked the other way. He'd built an empire where his whisper carried more weight than most men's shouts. But when he walked through the reinforced doors of his Seoul penthouse that evening, past the security team that cost him $40,000 monthly, past the marble foyer with the Chagall painting he'd acquired at a private auction for $12 million. He became powerless. CNU sat in the living room exactly where the nanny had left him. 6 years old, dressed in a Burberry sweater that cost more than most families spent on rent. The boy stared at the window overlooking the Han River, his expression as empty as the void Leo sometimes felt opening in his chest at 3 a.m. "I brought you something," Leo said, keeping his voice soft. Gentle. Nothing like the voice that had ordered Chen's educational demise. He set the box on the coffee table between them. Japanese import, limited edition. A robot that could be programmed to speak in multiple languages. $8,000. The sales associate had promised it was the most advanced toy on the market. CNU's eyes didn't move from the window. Leo opened the box himself, his hands that had signed execution orders without trembling, shaking slightly as he activated the toy. The robot whirred to life, speaking in cheerful Japanese. He switched it to Korean, then English, then back to Korean. "See? It can learn any language you want. You could teach it words, and it would remember. You could," he stopped himself. "Could make it say the things you won't say to me. Could give it the voice you're withholding like a weapon." The boy's small fingers moved, almost imperceptibly. For a moment, Leo's heart seized with hope. But CNU was only adjusting his sleeve, and then his hand fell still again. "I also got you this." Leo produced another box. A first edition signed collection of Korean children's stories, bound in leather, illustrated by an artist he'd commissioned specifically for this project. $25,000 for 12 stories. We could read them together. You could point to the words you like, and I could. Nothing. Not even a blink. Leo set the book down beside the ignored robot. The collection joined the graveyard of previous attempts, the custom-built treehouse in the penthouse garden, $150,000, the private theater with every animated film ever made, $200,000 for the equipment and licensing, the aquarium wall with rare exotic fish, $180,000, the vintage train set that circled the playroom, $90,000. He'd calculated the total once, during a sleepless night. $4.7 million in gifts over 2 years. Not counting the medical expenses. Not counting the specialists. Not counting the renovations he'd made to accommodate every doctor's suggestion. Leo could buy anything. Silence. Loyalty. Power. He'd purchased judges and politicians, entire police units and shipping routes. He'd bought his way out of prison sentences and international warrants. Money was a language he spoke fluently, and the world listened. But his son had somehow mastered the one currency Leo couldn't trade in: indifference. "Tomorrow," Leo said, standing, his knees protesting from kneeling too long on the floor, "I'll be back from Hong Kong. We could go somewhere. Anywhere you want. The aquarium? The children's museum." He waited. "Or we could stay here. Whatever you prefer." CNU's reflection in the window was ghostly, translucent. Like he was already fading. Like Leo was losing him in real time, watching him slip away despite every desperate attempt to hold on. Leo's phone buzzed. Moscow. Another territory, another deal, another expansion of his empire. He looked at his son's back, then at the phone, then back at his son. He answered the call. Because at least in his empire, when Leo Kangdae spoke, people responded. At least somewhere in this world, his voice still mattered. The irony didn't escape him. He'd built his fortune on understanding leverage, on knowing exactly which pressure points would make anyone break. The irony didn't escape him. He'd built his fortune on understanding leverage, on knowing exactly which pressure points would make anyone break. But his 6-year-old son had found the one pressure point that would break him instead. CNU woke at 6:47 a.m. every morning. Not because of an alarm, but because that was when his mother used to bring him warm milk with honey, sitting on the edge of his bed and singing softly until his eyes opened. Now he woke to silence and the memory of her voice, which was fading a little more each day. That terrified him more than anything, that soon he wouldn't remember the exact pitch of her laughter, the way she pronounced his name with that slight upturn at the end, like it was a question and a celebration at once. He dressed himself in the clothes Ms. Park laid out the night before. Navy shorts, white shirt, socks that matched. His mother used to let him wear mismatched socks on Thursdays because she said rules were made to be bent on Thursdays. But Ms. Park didn't know about Thursday socks, and C&U couldn't tell her. Couldn't tell anyone. Because telling meant using his voice, and his voice belonged to the before time, when his mother was alive and his father wasn't a monster. The photograph was hidden under his pillow. He pulled it out carefully, the edges worn soft from 2 years of nightly handling. His mother smiled out at him, holding him as a baby, her eyes crinkled with joy. C&U pressed his thumb over his baby self's face, so it looked like just her. Just mommy. The way he needed to remember her, without the complications of family, without his father lurking somewhere outside the frame. He'd been 4 when he'd heard them fighting. Not fighting like normal parents, no raised voices, no slammed doors. Worse. The cold kind of fighting where every word was calculated. He'd gotten up to use the bathroom and heard his mother's voice from his father's study, tight with fear. I can't keep pretending I don't know what you do, Kangdae. I can't raise our son in this. You don't have a choice. His father's voice, flat as concrete. I have evidence. Documents. I'll take C&U and... You'll what? A pause that stretched like ice cracking. You'll testify? Destroy everything I've built? Take my son from me. Our son. And yes, if that's what it takes to. Then you've made a choice. His father's voice had dropped to that whisper C&U would later learn meant death. And choices have consequences. C&U had run back to bed, pulled the covers over his head, and tried to unhear it. But 3 nights later, Ms. Park had woken him with red eyes and trembling hands, telling him Mommy had been in a car accident. That Mommy was gone. That everything would be okay, which was the first lie adults told when nothing would ever be okay again. At the funeral, his father had stood at the casket in a black suit that probably cost more than the casket itself. C&U had watched him lean down, had seen his father's hand shake as he touched her cold face, had heard the single word his father whispered, necessary. That word. That terrible word that confirmed what 4-year-old C&U had suspected in his bones. His father had made Mommy go away. His father, who controlled everything, who made people disappear with phone calls, had decided his mother was a problem that needed solving. And C&U had learned something that night that most children never learn, that love and murder could exist in the same person, that his father could cry over a casket while being responsible for filling it, that necessary was the word monsters used to sleep at night. So he stopped talking. Not because he couldn't, but because words were dangerous. His mother had used words, evidence, testify, leave, and words had gotten her killed. If C&U stayed silent, if he made himself small and quiet and forgettable, maybe his father wouldn't decide he was a problem too. Maybe silence was the only language that couldn't be used against you. Miss Park brought breakfast at 7:30 a.m. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice. She sat with him while he ate, filling the silence with gentle observations about the weather, the garden, the birds outside. She never pushed him to speak. She never looked at him with the desperate hunger his father did, like C&U's voice was something to be extracted, purchased, demanded. Your father called from Hong Kong, she said softly, buttering her own toast. He'll be back tonight. He asked what you might want for dinner. C&U focused on his eggs. His father was always asking through intermediaries, always trying to find the magic combination of gifts or foods or activities that would unlock his son's voice. As if C&U's silence was a code to be cracked rather than a choice to be respected. As if his father didn't know exactly why C&U couldn't speak to him. Sometimes C&U wondered if his father really didn't know. If adults could lie to themselves so completely that they forgot their own crimes. Or maybe his father knew perfectly well, and the gifts were apologies he was too coward-ward to speak aloud. The robot. The books. The treehouse. All of them translations of the words his father couldn't say. I killed your mother, and I don't know how to make that right, so here's $8,000 worth of distraction. But C&U didn't want toys. He wanted his Thursday socks and his mother's honey milk and the feeling of safety he'd lost the night he heard that word, necessary. He finished his breakfast in silence, rinsed his plate in the sink because his mother had taught him to clean up after himself, and walked to the playroom where he would spend another day existing in the empire his father built on blood and lies. Outside the window, Seoul glittered in the morning sun, beautiful and indifferent. Somewhere in that city, his father was making people disappear, building his kingdom of whispers and violence. And here in the penthouse fortress, CNU was disappearing too, one silent day at a time. His mother's photo stayed under his pillow. Evidence of a love that existed before everything turned necessary. Proof that once, briefly, he'd been someone's whole world. His mother's photo stayed under his pillow. Evidence of a love that existed before everything turned necessary. Proof that once, briefly, he'd been someone's whole world. Before his father decided the world was more important. Dmitry Volkov noticed the pattern before anyone else did. That was why he'd survived 20 years in the Russian Bratva, while smarter men had ended up in the Moskva River wearing concrete shoes. Dmitry didn't survive by being the strongest or the most brutal. He survived by paying attention to the details other men dismissed. And the details around Liu Kangdae were screaming. He pulled up the spreadsheet on his encrypted laptop, cross-referencing 3 months of data his intelligence network had compiled. The conference room in his Moscow headquarters was empty except for his second-in-command, Alexei, who stood by the window smoking a cigarette that probably violated 6 building codes. "Look at this," Dmitry said, turning the screen. Hong Kong gambling operation, September 15th. Leo misses the collection deadline by 14 hours. First time in 7 years. Could be a banking issue, Alexei offered. Could be. Except here, Dmitry tapped another entry. Washington Territory dispute, October 3rd. Leo's lawyer shows up instead of Leo. The lawyer settles for 60 cents on the dollar when Leo never settles for less than full payment. Maybe he was sick. Maybe. Or maybe Dmitry pulled up security footage from Seoul, grainy but clear enough. Liu Kangdae, the untouchable king of whispers, kneeling on a playroom floor in front of a small boy, his hands outstretched like a beggar. Maybe the great Liu Kangdae has developed a weakness. Alexei moved closer to the screen, his cigarette forgotten. The sun. The silent sun. Dmitry had done his research. Medical files acquired through a bribed hospital administrator. Therapy records purchased from a disgraced psychologist. Nanny interviews conducted through intermediaries. The picture was clear. Liu Kangdae was obsessed with fixing something that couldn't be fixed with money or violence. He's distracted. For the first time since I've known him, Leo is looking sideways instead of forward. So we move on his territories? We don't move. The Red Wolves move. Dmitry smiled, pulling up another file. The Red Wolves were a Chinese-Korean hybrid gang out of Busan, ambitious and stupid in equal measure. Perfect pawns. We feed them intelligence. Let them think they discovered Leo's weakness themselves. They squeeze his Korean operations, and when Leo retaliates, we use the chaos to renegotiate our partnership terms. And if the Red Wolves actually succeed in taking territory, then we take it from them. Dmitry closed the laptop. Either way, we win. 3 days later, the first squeeze began in Busan. A gambling den Leo controlled, operating out of a basement beneath a restaurant, suddenly found itself raided by men wearing red bandanas. No police involvement, which meant the Red Wolves had paid off the right people. They took $200,000 in cash and hospitalized 3 of Leo's men. The message was clear. The armor had cracks and the wolves could smell blood. Leo's phone lit up with the news while he was sitting at CNU's bedside, reading aloud from one of the expensive storybooks. The boy was staring at the ceiling, and Leo's voice had gone hoarse from narrating adventures his son was determinately ignoring. When he saw the message from his Busan lieutenant, his jaw tightened. "I have to make a call," he said softly to CNU, who didn't react. "I'll be right back." But he wouldn't be right back. The call would lead to 3 more calls, which would lead to an emergency video conference with his Seoul operations team, which would stretch past midnight. By the time Leo returned to CNU's room, the boy would be asleep, and another night of potential connection would be lost to the empire that was now under siege. By Friday, the Red Wolves had hit 2 more of Leo's operations. A shipping route through Incheon disrupted. A money laundering front in Gangnam firebombed. The attacks were coordinated, which meant someone was feeding them intelligence. Leo's inner circle began to fracture as suspicion spread like poison. His sole lieutenant, Park Jin-ho, suggested pulling resources from the Hong Kong operation to reinforce Korea. His Hong Kong partner wanted the opposite. The Russians, led by Dmitry, called to express concern about the stability of their joint ventures. Every conversation felt like a negotiation, when 6 months ago, Leo's word had been absolute law. "You need to respond," Jin-ho said during their Saturday strategy session. "The Red Wolves hit us 3 times this week. Every day you wait, we look weaker. Our people are starting to ask questions." Leo sat in his home office, staring at tactical maps spread across his desk. Red pins marked the attacks. Blue pins marked his remaining strong positions. The red was spreading like an infection. "I'll handle it." "When?" "Because they hit another shipment this morning. That's $300,000 in product gone. At this rate." "I said I'll handle it." Leo's voice carried that whisper edge that usually ended conversations, but Jin-ho didn't back down. "With respect, sir, you haven't been handling anything lately. You missed the Macau meeting. You've been late to 3 conference calls. Your mind is—" Jin-ho stopped, choosing his words carefully. "Your mind is elsewhere." Elsewhere. Such a gentle word for what was actually happening. His mind wasn't elsewhere. It was trapped in a playroom with a 6-year-old boy who wouldn't speak, circling the same impossible problem while his empire burned at the edges. "Give me 48 hours, Leo said finally. "I'll deal with the Red Wolves." But when he hung up and walked past CNU's room, he saw his son sitting in his usual spot by the window, and Leo's feet stopped moving. 48 hours to save his empire, or 5 minutes to try once more to reach his son. The choice should have been obvious. Empires were built over decades. They could withstand a few more minutes of neglect. Except the cracks were showing, and everyone could see them now. The King of Whispers was losing his grip, one silent day at a time, while rivals circled like sharks who'd finally sensed blood in the water. Dmitry watched the reports come in from his Moscow office and smiled. Leo Kangdae was doing exactly what Dmitry had predicted, hesitating, second-guessing, choosing his son over his empire in small but significant ways. And hesitation, in their world, was just another word for suicide. Dr. Sarah Brennan had worked with traumatized children in war zones, refugee camps, and psychiatric hospitals across 4 continents. She'd treated victims of abuse, survivors of natural disasters, and children who'd witnessed atrocities that would break most adults. Her credentials filled 2 pages. Her fee was $50,000 for a single consultation, and she was worth every cent. Leo paid double to get her on a plane from Boston within 24 hours. She arrived at the penthouse on Monday morning, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, carrying a leather bag that probably contained more psychological expertise than all of Leo's previous specialists combined. Ms. Park led her to the playroom where CNU sat with his usual coloring books, mechanically filling in shapes without any apparent interest in the colors he chose. Leo watched from the doorway as Dr. Brennan introduced herself, her voice calm and professional. She didn't force interaction, didn't demand responses. She simply sat on the floor across from CNU and began drawing in her own notebook, occasionally making observations about the weather, the view, the way light came through the windows. 40 minutes passed. CNU colored. Dr. Brennan drew. Neither spoke. Leo's jaw tightened with each passing minute. $50,000, and the woman was just sitting there. But he'd promised himself he wouldn't interfere, wouldn't impose his methods on someone he'd hired specifically because his methods had failed. After an hour, Dr. Brennan stood, brushed off her slacks, and walked to where Leo waited in the hallway. Her expression was carefully neutral. "Your study?" she asked. Leo led her to his office, a room dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul and a desk made from reclaimed ship timber that had cost more than most people's cars. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She remained standing. "Your son is not mute," she began without preamble. "I'm sure you've been told this before. He has no physical impediment to speech." What he has is selective mutism triggered by severe psychological trauma. I know this. Leo's fingers drummed against his desk. Every specialist has told me the same thing. What I need is someone who can fix it. Fix it. Dr. Brennan's tone didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. Mr. Kong, your son doesn't need to be fixed. He needs to feel safe enough to speak. There's a significant difference. I've made this house the safest place in Seoul. Armed guards, reinforced walls, security systems that. Physical safety isn't psychological safety, Mr. Kang. She pulled out a tablet, tapping through notes she'd made during her observation. Your son's selective mutism isn't random. He speaks to Ms. Park. I've reviewed the recordings you provided. He has full language capability. But he doesn't speak to you, and based on my assessment, he doesn't speak to anyone he associates with you or your profession. Leo's expression went carefully blank. My profession. I'm not naive, Mr. Kong. I know who you are. What you do. And, more importantly, your son knows. She met his gaze without flinching. Children are remarkably perceptive. They understand far more than we give them credit for. Your son has witnessed or overheard something that has made him fundamentally unsafe in your presence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Leo's voice went to that whisper pitch that preceded violence. You're suggesting I've harmed my son. I'm suggesting your son has been harmed by something connected to you. There's a difference, though I suspect that difference is smaller than you'd like to admit. Dr. Brennan closed her tablet. The question you need to ask yourself isn't, how do I make him speak? The question is, what does my son know that makes him choose silence over communication with me? Leo stood slowly, his hands flat on the desk. Men had died for less confrontational statements. His voice was ice. I hired you to help my son, not psychoanalyze me. Your son's trauma is directly connected to you, Mr. Kong. You can't treat one without addressing the other. She paused, then took a calculated risk. When did his mother die? That has nothing to. 2 years ago. Selective mutism began immediately after. Car accident, the file says. But your son doesn't have typical grief responses. He has fear responses. Specifically, fear associated with you. Dr. Brennan's voice remained professionally calm, but her words cut like surgical blades. I've seen this pattern before. Children who witness violence, children who lose a parent and believe the surviving parent is responsible. The silence isn't grief, Mr. Kong. It's self-preservation. Leo moved around the desk with the predatory grace of a man who'd committed violence in rooms nicer than this. Dr. Brennan didn't step back, which was either remarkably brave or professionally suicidal. He stopped inches from her, close enough that she'd feel the threat radiating from him. You're accusing me of killing my wife. I'm observing that your son believes you're dangerous. Whether that belief is justified or not isn't my concern. What is my concern is that you hired me to help your son, but you're not willing to examine the actual source of his trauma. She held his gaze. Which suggests you already know what that source is. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of Seoul traffic 40 stories below. Leo's hands flexed at his sides, the same hands that had signed execution orders, that had made people disappear with gestures. Dr. Brennan watched those hands carefully. I think, Leo said quietly, each word precisely controlled, that our consultation is finished. I think you're right. She picked up her bag, moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Mr. Kong, you love your son. That's obvious. But love without accountability is just another form of violence. Your son is waiting for you to acknowledge what he knows. Until you do, he'll choose silence. Because silence, to him, is safer than the truth. She walked out, leaving Leo standing in his office surrounded by the empire he'd built on secrets and violence. Through the walls, he could hear CNU in the playroom, the soft scratch of crayons on paper. Still coloring. Still silent. Still safe in the fortress of words he'd never speak to his father. Leo's phone buzzed. Another attack from the Red Wolves. Another territory breach. His empire bleeding while he stood paralyzed by a child psychologist's observations. She was wrong. She had to be wrong. Because if she was right, if CNU's silence was self-preservation, then Leo wasn't just failing to reach his son. He was the reason his son needed protecting in the first place. CNU wasn't supposed to be awake. Ms. Park had put him to bed at 8:30 p.m., read him 2 stories he'd listened to without response, and turned off the lights. She'd checked on him at 9 p.m., and he'd been lying still, eyes closed, breathing steady. By all appearances, asleep. But CNU had learned years ago how to fake sleep convincingly. It was a survival skill, like his silence. Adults left you alone when they thought you were sleeping. They talked more freely. They forgot you were there, small and quiet in the dark, witnessing things children weren't supposed to see. At 10:47 p.m., he heard raised voices from his father's study. Not his father's voice raised, his father never raised his voice. But another man's voice, sharp with panic and pleading. CNU slipped out of bed, his feet silent on the hardwood floor. He'd mapped every creaking board in the penthouse over 2 years of careful observation. He knew exactly where to step. The study door was cracked open. Just an inch, maybe less. Enough. Through the gap, CNU saw his father sitting behind his desk, perfectly still. The man standing across from him was Korean, middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit that was now rumpled with sweat. Park Jin-ho. CNU recognized him from previous visits. One of his father's men. I can explain the Hong Kong situation, Jin-ho was saying, his hands gesturing desperately. The Red Wolves had inside information. Someone in our network. Someone in our network, his father repeated softly. Yes, that's what concerns me, Jin-ho. It wasn't me. I swear on my daughter's life, it wasn't. Don't. His father's voice went to that whisper edge that made CNU's stomach clench. Don't swear on your daughter's life when you're lying to me. I find that particularly distasteful. Jin-ho's face went white. Boss, please. 20 years I've worked for you. 20 years of loyalty. I pulled your phone records. His father opened a folder on his desk, sliding a single page across the surface. 17 calls to a Moscow number over the past 6 weeks. The number belongs to Dmitry Volkov's lieutenant. Would you like to explain those calls, Jin-ho? Or should I assume you were discussing the weather? The silence stretched. CNU pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering so hard he was sure they'd hear it. He should go back to bed. Should run away from whatever was about to happen. But his feet wouldn't move. It's not what you think, Jin-ho said finally. Dmitry approached me. Said he wanted to make a deal. I was gathering intelligence for you, trying to. Jin-ho. His father stood, and, even from his hiding spot, CNU could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. Like air pressure dropping before a storm. I've known you for 20 years. I know when you're lying. I know when you're scared. And right now, you're both. Please. Jin-ho backed toward the door. My family. My daughter is only 8 years old. Whatever you think I've done. His father moved faster than CNU had ever seen him move. One moment he was behind the desk, the next he was across the room, one hand gripping Jin-ho's throat, slamming him against the wall beside the door. The impact made a sound like meat hitting pavement. Your daughter is 8, his father said, conversational now, as if he weren't choking a man. Same age you told Dmitry my son was, which was your first lie. CNU is 6. If you're going to sell information about my family, at least get the details correct. Jin-ho's face was turning purple. His hands clawed at his father's wrist uselessly. CNU wanted to close his eyes, wanted to unsee this, but his body was frozen. Just like that night 2 years ago when he'd heard his mother's name and the word necessary. Here's what's going to happen, his father continued, still in that terrible whisper. You're going to call Dmitry. You're going to tell him the Red Wolves' next target, a location I'll provide. And when the Red Wolves arrive, they'll find my men waiting. Do you understand? Jin-ho managed a strangled nod. Good. His father released him. Jin-ho collapsed to his knees, gasping, one hand at his throat. You have 12 hours to make that call. After that, I won't need you to make it. I'll just need to make sure Dmitry understands what happens to people who buy information from traders. And my family? Jin-ho's voice was ragged. Your family remains untouched. For now. His father returned to his desk, sat down as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just demonstrated how easily he could kill a man. But Jin-ho? If you ever use my son as a bargaining chip again, if you ever put CNU in anyone's crosshairs, I will make you watch while I dismantle everything you love. Your daughter. Your wife. Your aging mother in Tegu. I will erase them methodically, and I will make sure you survive long enough to witness every moment. Am I clear? Yes, boss. Crystal clear. Then get out of my sight. Jinho scrambled to his feet and rushed toward the door. CNU barely managed to pull back into the shadows before Jinho burst into the hallway, clutching his throat, his face a mask of terror and shame. The man didn't even notice the small boy pressed against the wall, a ghost witnessing his father's violence. CNU waited until Jinho's footsteps faded, until the elevator dinged, until the penthouse was silent again. Then he crept back to his room on trembling legs, climbed into bed, and pulled his mother's photo from under the pillow. His father had been calm. That was the worst part. No anger, no rage. Just cold efficiency. The same calm voice his father used when reading bedtime stories CNU pretended not to hear. The same steady hands that had tried to give him expensive gifts. Those hands had just crushed a man's throat like it was nothing, like violence was as natural as breathing. Dr. Brennan had asked what CNU knew that made silence safer than speaking. Now he had his answer updated, confirmed, reinforced. He knew his father was a monster who wore a human face. He knew those gentle attempts to connect were the same hands that dealt death. He knew that love in his father's world meant threatening to destroy someone's entire family. And he knew that if he ever spoke, if he ever gave his father the satisfaction of connection, it would mean accepting this. Accepting that love and violence could coexist. Accepting that his father was both the man who killed his mother and the man who desperately wanted his son's voice. CNU clutched the photograph tighter, his small body curled around the only proof that love didn't have to hurt, that mothers existed who never whispered necessary before destroying lives. Outside his window, Seoul glittered with its 1,000 lights, beautiful and poisonous. Inside his room, CNU made a decision that his 6-year-old mind understood with perfect clarity. Silence wasn't just self-preservation anymore. Silence was his only act of defiance. The only power he had against a father who controlled everything else. And he would hold on to it until one of them broke completely. The Hanseong International Academy was supposed to be impenetrable. Leo had personally vetted the security, reinforced gates, armed guards disguised as maintenance staff, cameras covering every angle, and a dedicated security detail that followed CNU at a distance throughout the school day. He'd paid the headmaster an additional $500,000 annually to accommodate these measures. The school's board hadn't asked questions. At 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, all of that security meant nothing. CNU was in art class, mechanically painting watercolor shapes, while the teacher praised work he wasn't trying to create. The other children had stopped trying to talk to him months ago. He'd become the ghost boy, present but not participating, there but not really there. The teacher had learned to let him exist in his bubble. The fire alarm started at 2:18 p.m. Standard protocol. Students line up, teachers do head counts, everyone files calmly to the designated assembly area. CNU had practiced this drill 4 times. He knew exactly where to stand, which teacher to follow, how long it typically took. The routine was almost comforting in its predictability. What wasn't routine was the white van idling in the staff parking lot with its side door already open. What wasn't routine was the 2 men in maintenance uniforms who weren't part of the regular security staff. CNU's bodyguard, Agent Han, noticed both anomalies simultaneously. He grabbed CNU's arm, pulling him back toward the building entrance just as the 2 men moved. One went for the teacher, the other went for Han. The motion was practiced, professional. Not random criminals. Trained operators. Han had his weapon drawn in less than a second, his body between CNU and the threat. "Code Black," he shouted into his radio. "Code Black, south entrance." The man going for the teacher pulled a gun. Children screamed. The orderly evacuation dissolved into chaos. Han fired first, center mass, dropping the man instantly. But the second attacker was already on him, and they went down in a tangle of limbs and violence that was too fast, too brutal for CNU's mind to fully process. Someone grabbed CNU from behind. A third man, this one coming from the van. Hands like iron bands around his chest, lifting him off his feet. CNU kicked, twisted, tried to bite, but the man was too strong. They were moving toward the van, 10 meters away, then 8, then 6. A black Mercedes screamed into the parking lot, tires shrieking. The passenger door opened before the car fully stopped, and Liu Kangde emerged with a pistol already raised. He fired 3 times. The man holding CNU jerked, stumbled, and dropped. CNU hit the pavement hard, skinning his palms, tasting blood from a bitten tongue. His father was on him instantly, one hand checking for injuries, the other still holding the gun trained on potential threats. "Are you hurt?" "CNU, look at me. Are you hurt?" CNU stared at his father's face, really looked at it for the first time in months. His father's expression was something CNU had never seen before, raw, undisguised terror. Not the controlled violence from the study. Not the desperate pleading from their one-sided conversations. This was fear, pure and primal, the fear of almost losing something irreplaceable. More cars arrived. Leo's security team, flooding the school grounds. Police sirens in the distance, paid off or not, they'd have to respond to gunfire at a school. His father was already moving, scooping CNU up, carrying him toward the Mercedes. Agent Han, bleeding from a cut above his eye but alive, provided cover. They were in the car and moving before CNU could fully process what had happened. His father held him in the back seat, one arm wrapped around him protectively, the other hand on his phone issuing rapid-fire commands in Korean. "Lock down all properties. Pull security from Hong Kong if necessary. I want every available man on my son. Now." CNU's hands were shaking. His palms stung where he'd scraped them. His tongue throbbed. But those were distant sensations compared to the realization settling over him like ice water. His father's world had just tried to kill him. Not hypothetically. Not as a vague future threat. Actually tried, with guns and a van and men who'd been willing to shoot a teacher in front of screaming children. "You're safe now," his father was saying, his voice cracking in a way CNU had never heard. "I've got you. You're safe." But that was a lie, and even at 6 years old, CNU understood it completely. He wasn't safe. He would never be safe. Not as long as he was Liu Kangde's son. Not as long as his father's empire existed. Every rival, every betrayed partner, every ambitious subordinate, they all knew the same thing Dmitri had figured out. CNU was the weakness. The crack in the armor. The pressure point that could break an unbreakable man. His father had saved him today. Had arrived impossibly fast, had killed to protect him, had shown that raw parental terror that proved his love was real, however twisted. But his father was also the reason he needed saving in the first place. The Mercedes weaved through Seoul traffic, running red lights, taking routes designed to lose potential tails. His father's phone kept buzzing. Reports coming in. 2 attackers dead, 1 wounded and captured. Agent Han stable, the school in lockdown, police contained. The machine of his father's empire grinding into action, covering tracks, controlling the narrative, ensuring this attempted kidnapping would disappear from official records by nightfall. "I'm pulling you from school," his father said finally, his arms still wrapped protectively around CNU. "You'll have private tutors at home. The penthouse has better security." "I can control," he stopped himself, perhaps hearing what CNU heard, control. Always control. As if the world could be bent to his will through force and money. But the world had just proven it couldn't be controlled. Not completely. Not when there were men like Dmitri who saw a 6-year-old boy not as a child, but as a strategic asset. Not as someone to protect, but as someone to exploit. CNU looked out the window at Seoul streaming past, the city his father claimed to rule. Every building might hide an enemy. Every street corner might conceal a threat. The entire glittering empire his father had built was a prison, and CNU was the most valuable hostage. His father was still talking, making promises about safety and protection, and how this would never happen again. But CNU had stopped listening. He was thinking about the man his father had shot, the way the body had jerked and fallen. Thinking about Agent Han fighting with professional brutality to keep CNU alive. Thinking about the teacher who'd been knocked unconscious, innocent collateral damage in his father's war. This was his inheritance. Not wealth or power, but violence. An endless cycle of threats and counter-threats, of protection that required killing, of love that came wrapped in gunfire. And the worst part, the truly devastating realization that settled into CNU's chest like a stone. His father would never let him go. Would never send him away to safety, to a normal life far from this world. Because his father loved him too much. Because admitting CNU needed to be removed from this life would mean admitting the life itself was poison. So they would stay locked together in this fortress of violence and silence. His father would increase security, eliminate threats, build higher walls. And CNU would remain trapped behind those walls, the silent prisoner of a love too toxic to save him and too strong to release him. The Mercedes pulled into the underground garage of their building. Armed guards flanked the entrance. More security measures that would turn their home into an even tighter cage. His father finally released him, kneeling to check his scraped palms, his face still showing that terrible fear love that CNU now understood completely. "I won't let anyone hurt you," his father promised. Never again. CNU said nothing. Because promises meant nothing when the entire world wanted you dead for being someone's son. Because safety was impossible when your protector was also your greatest danger. Because silence was still the only honest response to a father who'd built an empire on violence and somehow expected his son to thrive in its shadow. The emergency strategy meeting convened at midnight in Leo's private conference room, a space designed for conversations that couldn't exist in official records. 8 men sat around the obsidian table, each representing a key territory in Leo's empire. Hong Kong, Macau, Washington, Tokyo, Moscow Partnership, Seoul Operations, Financial Networks, and Choi Sang-min, Leo's second-in-command for the past 12 years, the man who'd helped build this empire from a regional gambling operation into a multi-continental syndicate. The man who was about to commit professional suicide. Leo stood at the head of the table, his face carved from stone. The kidnapping attempt had been 48 hours ago. His intelligence network had confirmed what he'd suspected. Dmitri had orchestrated it, using the Red Wolves as expendable assets. The captured attacker had provided names before dying of complications in custody. The message was clear: Dmitri was escalating, and the target was CNU. "We've lost 30% of our Busan operations," the Seoul representative reported, pulling up spreadsheets on the display screen. "The Red Wolves have taken 4 more territories in the past week. Our men are requesting permission to retaliate, but without clear leadership on the ground." "Without you on the ground," Choi interrupted, his eyes on Leo. "They're saying you've been absent. That you're prioritizing personal matters over the organization." The room went silent. Everyone heard the accusation beneath the corporate language. Personal matters. The polite way of saying your son. Leo's expression didn't change. "Continue the Seoul report." "There's nothing to continue," Choi said, standing. He'd been drinking. Leo could smell it across the table. Scotch, expensive, but his second-in-command's words were still precise. Too precise. Rehearsed. "We're losing ground every day you're distracted. The Hong Kong partners are asking questions. Tokyo is considering restructuring. Even Moscow is making noise about renegotiating terms." "Then we remind them why renegotiation isn't an option," Leo said quietly. "With what leverage?" Choi spread his hands. "The great Leo Kangdae, who once controlled 3 continents with a phone call, can't even control a 6-year-old child." That's what they're saying. That's the perception. Perception can be managed. Not when the perception is true. Choi walked around the table, and Leo noticed the other men shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't spontaneous, drunken honesty. This was a prepared intervention. "You've missed 8 critical meetings in the past month. You've delegated decisions that should have been yours. You pulled security from our Hong Kong operation to guard a school." "A school, Leo. While our actual operations are bleeding." Leo's hands remained flat on the table, but his voice dropped to that whisper edge. "Careful, Sang-min. Someone needs to say it." Choi stopped directly across from Leo. "Your son is a liability." A weak point that's being exploited by every rival we have. And instead of addressing it strategically, you're playing father, trying to fix something that can't be fixed with protection details and expensive therapists. You're suggesting? Leo's words were ice. I'm suggesting we remove the liability. Choi glanced around the table, finding nods of agreement from at least 3 other men. The boy goes to boarding school. Switzerland, maybe. Somewhere far from here, with his own security, his own life. You focus on saving this empire before there's nothing left to inherit. Boarding school, Leo repeated, his tone unreadable. Or better. Choi leaned forward, and the Scotch courage was evident now. We stage another kidnapping. This time successful. The boy disappears, tragic but final. You become the sympathetic figure, the father who lost everything, and enemies lose their leverage. A calculated sacrifice for. He never finished the sentence. Leo moved with the speed that had made him legendary in the underground, closing the distance and slamming Choi's face into the obsidian table with enough force to crack bone. Blood sprayed across the polished surface. Choi crumpled, and Leo was on him, one hand gripping his throat, the other pulling a knife from his belt. You just suggested I murder my son. Leo's voice was conversational, almost curious. After 12 years of partnership, you walked into this room and suggested I kill a 6-year-old child to improve quarterly earnings. Is that correct? Choi gurgled, his hands clawing uselessly at Leo's grip. The other men sat frozen, caught between loyalty and self-preservation. No one moved to help. Let me be extraordinarily clear. Leo pressed the knife against Choi's throat, not cutting but promising. My son is not a liability. He is not a strategic asset. He is not a negotiating position or a quarterly report. He is my son. And any man in this organization who suggests otherwise can join Chen Weilin in providing educational examples. He released Choi, who collapsed to the floor gasping, blood pouring from his shattered nose. Leo straightened his suit jacket, returned to his position at the head of the table, and addressed the room as if he hadn't just committed assault in front of witnesses. Here's what's going to happen. We're pulling all external security back to core operations. CNU will be protected by a dedicated team that operates independently of organizational assets. That team reports only to me. No one in this room, no one in this organization will use my son's name in strategic discussions again. Am I clear? Murmured agreements. Eyes avoiding his gaze. Good. Hong Kong, you have authorization to respond to the Red Wolves with extreme prejudice. Seoul, consolidate our remaining territories and fortify positions. Moscow, tell Dmitry we're accepting his meeting request. I'll deal with him personally. Leo paused, looking at each man in turn. And if I hear even a whisper suggesting that my son is somehow responsible for our tactical challenges, I will assume that whisper came from someone at this table. Understood. More murmurs. Choi was crawling toward the door, leaving a blood trail on the marble floor. Leo let him go. After the men filed out quickly, carefully, Leo remained alone in the conference room, staring at the blood on his table. His phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Park. CNU couldn't sleep. Having nightmares about the school. She was staying with him. Leo typed a response, deleted it, tried again. The words felt inadequate. Everything felt inadequate. His second-in-command had just suggested killing his son. Not hypothetically. Not as a theoretical option. Actually suggested it, and at least 3 other men had nodded agreement before Leo had responded with violence. His empire was eating itself. The men he'd trusted were turning on the one thing he couldn't sacrifice. And the worst realization, the one that made his hands shake as he deleted his 3rd attempt at a text to Ms. Park, was that Choi was right about everything except the solution. CNU was a liability. The empire was crumbling. Leo was distracted, absent, failing at the one thing he'd spent 2 decades building. Every enemy knew exactly where to strike. His son was the pressure point, and Leo had no defense against it because the only real defense was the one thing he'd never consider. Walking away. Leaving the empire. Choosing his son over his power. But Leo Kongdae didn't know how to be anything except this. Didn't know how to exist without the empire that had consumed his entire adult life. He'd killed for it, lied for it, sacrificed his wife for it, though that truth was one he couldn't acknowledge even to himself. The empire was his identity, his purpose, his proof that he mattered in a world that tried to erase men like him. And now it demanded a choice he couldn't make: his son or his power, his humanity or his empire. His phone buzzed again. "Miss Park, he's asking for you." In his own way, looking toward the door. Leo stared at the message, then at the blood on his conference table, then at his reflection in the darkened windows overlooking Seoul. The city he'd conquered glittered below him, indifferent to his crisis. Somewhere in that city, Dmitri was planning his next move. The Red Wolves were consolidating their gains. His own men were calculating whether their loyalty was worth less than their survival. And 40 floors above the chaos, his 6-year-old son was having nightmares, looking toward a door, hoping for a father who didn't know how to stop being a monster long enough to provide comfort. Leo left the conference room, walked past the security detail, took the private elevator to his penthouse floor. He found CNUS room, saw Ms. Park sitting beside the bed, saw his son curled around that photograph of his mother. "I can stay," Leo said quietly from the doorway. Ms. Park looked at him, at the blood on his cuffs he'd forgotten to hide, and something like pity crossed her face. "I think he needs consistency right now, Mr. Kong. Not complicated. Not you," she meant. Not the father who saves him with violence and whose empire tries to kill him. Not the walking contradiction of love and danger. Leo nodded and retreated. Behind him, CNUS eyes opened briefly. He'd been awake the whole time, listening, before closing again in that practiced fake sleep that meant rejection. The empire or his son. Power or humanity. And Leo stood between both choices, unable to abandon either, watching them destroy each other while he bled from wounds he couldn't heal. The power died at 3:47 a.m. with the surgical precision of a planned operation. No flicker, no warning, just instant darkness swallowing 40 floors of steel and glass. Backup generators should have engaged within 3 seconds. They didn't. Someone had done their homework. Leo was awake instantly, muscle memory from 2 decades of survival overriding the fog of his first sleep in 72 hours. His hand found the Beretta on his nightstand in the dark, his phone in the other hand already dialing his security chief. Deadline. Cell towers jammed or cut. He moved his window overlooking Seoul and saw what confirmed his worst fear. The entire block was dark, but neighboring blocks glowed with normal city lights. Targeted blackout. Professional execution. They were coming. He was halfway to CNUS room when the first explosion ripped through the ground floor. The building shuddered. Emergency lighting flickered on in the hallways, battery-powered, independent systems, casting everything in blood-red shadows. Leo ran. CNUS room was empty. Bed still warm. The panic that seized Leo's chest was immediately controlled, forced down through sheer will. Miss Park. She'd have taken him to the panic room the moment the power failed. That was protocol. That was training he'd drilled into her 100 times. He found them in the hallway, Ms. Park carrying CNU, moving toward the reinforced safe room built into the penthouse's core. The boy's eyes were wide, but his face was blank, that practiced emptiness he wore like armor. He locked eyes with Leo for one moment before Ms. Park reached the panic room door. "Get him inside," Leo ordered. "Biometric lock, maximum security. Don't open for anyone but me." "Sir, you should come with. I need to know what we're facing." He was already moving toward the security office, where hardwired systems independent of main power would show him camera feeds. "Lock that door. Now." The security office looked like a war room. 6 screens showing different angles of the building, and what Leo saw made his tactical mind start calculating odds of survival. 12 men, maybe 15, moving through the underground garage. Military formation. Professional gear. These weren't the Red Wolves street thugs. These were contractors. Dmitri had brought in specialists. Another explosion, this time on the 20th floor. Breaching charges. They were coming up through multiple vectors, garage, stairwells, possibly even the exterior. A coordinated assault designed to overwhelm his security through sheer force and speed. Leo's security team was responding, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. He watched on camera as 3 of his men went down in the garage, tactical precision cutting through their defense. The attackers were pushing toward the elevators and stairwells, moving to cut off all escape routes before advancing to the penthouse level. His phone, the hardwired landline in the security office, buzzed. "Internal system," he answered. "Boss, we can't hold them." It was Agent Han, the man who'd survived the school attack. His voice was tight with pain and barely suppressed panic. "They've got RPGs, body armor, thermal imaging. This isn't a kidnapping. This is an execution squad. How long can you buy me?" 10 minutes. Maybe 15 if we collapse the stairwells with the emergency charges. "Do it. Funnel them through the north stairwell only. I'll be waiting." "Boss, you need to get your son out. There's a helicopter extraction protocol. They'll have anti-air." "That's what I do." Leo was already moving, pulling weapons from the security lockers. His mind was racing through scenarios, calculating angles. 15 attackers. 1 building. 1 target. The math was brutally simple. Collapse the stairwells. "I'm going dark." He killed the emergency lighting manually, plunging the penthouse into absolute darkness. Then he cut the security feeds. If they had thermal imaging, he couldn't hide his heat signature, but he could deny them visual intelligence. The building became a tomb of darkness and silence. And in that silence, Leo understood something profound. For the first time in 6 years, he and his son shared the same language. Silence had been CNU's weapon, his defense, his only power in a world controlled by his father's words. Now silence was Leo's advantage too. The attackers had technology, training, numbers. But Leo had something they didn't: intimate knowledge of every inch of this building, every blind corner, every kill zone he designed specifically for a scenario like this. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, following paths he'd memorized during countless sleepless nights. The building's architecture was his language now, and silence was his grammar. Every footstep measured. Every breath controlled. He was hunting in his own territory, and the darkness made him invisible. The first attacker came through the north stairwell at 3:54 a.m. Thermal goggles, assault rifle, full tactical gear. Professional. Cautious. Sweeping corners. But he was expecting resistance, lights, a firefight. Not a shadow that materialized behind him and put 2 suppressed rounds through his skull before he could radio. Leo took the man's radio, his thermal goggles, and kept moving. Through the earpiece, he heard Russian-accented English coordinating the assault. 12 men confirmed. 3 searching floors 30 to 35. 6 pushing toward the penthouse level. 3 holding the garage as extraction team. Another explosion rocked the building, Han collapsing the south stairwell. Good. Now they had only one path up, and that path funneled through Leo's killing ground. He killed the second attacker in the corridor outside his own bedroom. The third died in the kitchen, never seeing the threat until the muzzle pressed against his spine. Each kill was silent, surgical, erasing Dimitri's assault team 1 man at a time while they advanced through darkness they didn't understand. But Leo was bleeding time, and he knew it. Eventually they'd realize their forward teams weren't reporting. Eventually they'd adapt. And he couldn't kill them all before they reached the panic room. At 4:03 a.m., the earpiece crackled. Floor 40, forward team not responding. Switch to defensive positions. Subject may be armed and mobile. They were learning. Adjusting. Now they'd be cautious, covering each other, moving in pairs. The easy kills were over. Leo made his way back toward the panic room through service corridors the attackers wouldn't know existed. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands steady despite the adrenaline. 8 men left, maybe 9. Still bad odds. Still survivable if he played it perfectly. He reached the corridor outside the panic room and found 2 attackers already there, working on the biometric lock with cutting torches. Through the reinforced door, Leo knew CNU was listening to the sounds of violence and death, was probably curled in the corner clutching that photograph of his mother, was experiencing the confirmation of every fear his father's world had planted in him. Leo shot the first attacker from 30 feet, center mass twice and once to the head. The second spun but never got his weapon up. Another 3-round burst. Both men down. The radio exploded with Russian. They knew where he was now. All remaining forces would converge on his position. Maybe 5 minutes before they arrived in overwhelming numbers. Leo approached the panic room door. His hands, covered in blood that wasn't his own, shaking with adrenaline he couldn't fully suppress, pressed against the biometric scanner. The door unlocked with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, lit only by emergency chemlight sticks, Ms. Park held CNU against her chest. The boy's eyes found his father's face, and in that moment, Leo saw it clearly. Not fear of the violence happening outside, but fear of the violence his father brought with him. The monster who'd just killed 5 men to protect him was still the same monster who'd killed his mother. "We need to move," Leo said quietly. "They're coming." "Where?" Ms. Park's voice was shaking. "Where can we possibly go that's safe?" "Nowhere." The honest answer was nowhere. As long as CNU was Leo Kangdae's son, as long as the Empire existed, there was no safe space. The fortress had been breached. The protector had become the danger. And the only solution, the one Leo's second-in-command had suggested in that blood-stained conference room, was the one choice Leo couldn't make. Another explosion. Closer this time. They were breaching through the walls now, bypassing corridors entirely. Dmitri had sent enough men and firepower to bring down the building if necessary. Leo looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw the truth reflected in those silent, accusing eyes. This was his inheritance. Not wealth or power, but an endless war where love meant making his child a target and protection meant surrounding him with death. "There's an extraction shaft," Leo said finally. "Maintenance elevator that runs to the basement." From there, he stopped. From there what? Run? Hide? Pretend that anywhere in the world was beyond Dimitri's reach? But CNU was watching him with an expression Leo had never seen before. Not emptiness. Not fear. Something else. Almost like understanding. Like his 6-year-old son had just realized the same truth Leo was facing. They were trapped together in a nightmare neither could escape. And in that moment of shared understanding, communicated entirely through silence, Leo made a decision that would either save his son or destroy them both. "I'm ending this," he said. "Tonight." The maintenance shaft was a vertical coffin of concrete and steel, designed for service access and never meant for human evacuation. Leo descended first, testing each rung of the ladder embedded in the wall, his Beretta secured at his hip, a flashlight clenched between his teeth. Above him, Ms. Park lowered CNU carefully, the boy's small hands gripping the ladder with surprising steadiness. They were 3 floors down when the radio crackled with Russian. Panic room breached. "Empty. Search all floors. Subject is mobile with a child." The words "mobile with a child" made Leo's jaw clench. Not protecting. Not evacuating. Mobile with. Like CNU was cargo, a tactical consideration, a thing to be acquired rather than a child to be saved. They reached sublevel 2, a maintenance floor that existed only on original building schematics, a space Leo had kept deliberately off official records. The kind of space men like him needed for conversations and activities that couldn't have witnesses. Now it was a tomb, concrete walls, emergency lighting on independent batteries, a single reinforced door that opened to a service tunnel leading to 3 different buildings. "Take him through the tunnel," Leo told Ms. Park, pressing a keycard into her hand. "Building C, apartment 1604. My man there will get you to a safe house. What about you?" Leo looked at his son, who was watching him with those 2 knowing eyes. "I'm going back up." Drawing them away. "They're tracking my phone signal, my heat signature. As long as they think I'm in the building with CNU, they'll focus here. Gives you time to disappear. They'll kill you. Maybe." Leo knelt in front of CNU, and for a moment his tactical mind shut off, leaving only the father who'd failed at everything except violence. "I need you to go with Ms. Park. Stay quiet, stay hidden. Can you do that for me?" CNU stared at him. Silent. Always silent. "Of course you can," Leo said softly. "You're the bravest person I know." He stood, checking his weapon, his remaining ammunition. Maybe 30 rounds. Against 6 or 7 trained contractors. Bad odds, but he'd survived worse. The key was making enough noise to draw them all to his position, far from the escape route. Sacrifice play. The kind of tactical decision he'd made 100 times with other people's lives. Strange how different it felt when the life was his own. He moved toward the ladder to begin his ascent when Ms. Park's voice stopped him. Mr. Kong. I need to tell you something. Not now. He talks. The words came out in a rush. Seeing you talks. Every day. Full sentences. He's been speaking for 2 years. Just never to you. Leo turned slowly. The confession hung in the air between them like smoke. He'd known intellectually after finding that security footage. Dr. Brennan had confirmed it. But hearing it stated so boldly, so finally, carved something vital out of his chest. I know, he said quietly. No, you don't understand. He talks about you. Ms. Park's eyes were wet. He asks questions. Why does Papa look sad? Does Papa remember Mommy? If I talk to Papa, will he go away too? He's not silent because he can't speak to you. He's silent because he's terrified of what speaking might mean. Above them, footsteps. Voices. The hunters closing in. Leo should move. Should execute his plan. Should climb that ladder and draw death away from his son. But his feet wouldn't move. Mr. Kang, he thinks if he acknowledges you, if he lets you in, he's accepting what you are. And he's terrified that loving you means becoming you. The lights flickered. Someone had found the sub-level access. Maybe 3 minutes before they breached this floor. Leo looked at the ladder, at the tactical decision that would save his son, then at CNU's face in the red emergency lighting. The boy was crying. Silently, tears streaming down his cheeks, but his face still maintained that practiced blankness. Crying like he'd learned to cry without making sound, without drawing attention, without being vulnerable in a world where vulnerability meant death. Leo made a choice. Not the tactical one. Not the one that maximized survival odds. He made the choice Dr. Brennan had told him was impossible for men like him. He chose connection over strategy. He sat down on the concrete floor, his back against the wall, and opened his arms. I'm not leaving, he said. Not this time. Come here. Ms. Park looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Above them, the footsteps were getting louder. The door would breach in minutes. They should be running, should be executing the escape plan. Instead, Leo sat in the red emergency light waiting for his son to make a choice. CNU didn't move. 30 seconds passed. 45. The footsteps were at the access door now. Leo heard Russian, heard cutting equipment warming up. Any moment they'd breach through, and Leo would have to fight in an enclosed space with his son in the crossfire. But he didn't move. Didn't reach for his weapon. Just sat there with his arms open, making the most vulnerable offer he'd ever made. Choose me anyway. Choose me despite knowing what I am. CNU took a step forward. Then another. Then he was running, colliding with his father's chest, small arms wrapping around Leo's neck with desperate strength. Leo held him, and for the first time in 2 years, his son's body wasn't rigid, wasn't performing blankness. He was shaking, sobbing silently into his father's shoulder. I'm sorry, Leo whispered. I'm so sorry. For everything. For your mother. For this life. For being the monster you're afraid I am. The cutting torch started on the door. Sparks flying. Maybe 60 seconds before breach. I can't fix what I've done, Leo continued, his voice breaking. I can't undo any of it. But I can stop running from it. I can stop pretending you don't know. You've always known, haven't you? Since the beginning. My brave, brilliant boy who sees everything and forgives nothing. CNU pulled back, his face wet with tears, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to remember how to form words for his father. Leo watched, not pushing, not demanding, just waiting. Papa. The word was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse, broken by sobs. But it was there. After 2 years, his son's voice speaking to him. Papa, I'm scared. I know. I'm scared too. They're going to hurt us. Probably. I don't want you to die. The words came faster now, 2 years of silence breaking like a dam. Even though you're bad. Even though you did bad things. I don't want them to kill you. Does that make me bad too? Leo pulled his son close again, his own tears finally falling. No. It makes you human. Better than me. Better than I deserve. The door exploded inward. 3 contractors entered tactical formation, weapons raised, laser sights cutting through the red emergency light. They found Leo Kangde sitting against the wall, holding his 6-year-old son, both of them crying, neither reaching for the weapon at Leo's hip. The lead contractor spoke in Russian-accented English. Mr. Volkov wants them alive. Both of them. Leo looked at his son, and CNU looked back, and in that moment of shared terror and impossible love, Leo made his final calculation. Not tactical. Not strategic. Simply this. His son had finally spoken to him, and Leo would do anything, surrender his empire, his power, his life, to hear that voice again. Don't shoot, Leo said, raising his hands slowly, keeping one arm around CNU. We surrender. Just don't hurt him. Please. The great Leo Kangde, who'd never begged for anything, who'd built an empire on pride and violence, was begging now. Not for his life, but for his son's safety. The contractors moved forward, weapons trained, zip ties ready. Ms. Park stood frozen against the wall, watching the King of Whispers become a prisoner, watching the boy who'd been silent for 2 years cling to his father's neck, watching an empire collapse not from external force, but from the weight of accumulated guilt and impossible love. Papa, CNU whispered as the contractors separated them, pulling Leo's hands behind his back. Papa, don't let go. Never, Leo promised, even as they forced him away. I'm never letting go again. It was a promise he had no power to keep, made by a man who'd lost everything, to the son who'd finally given him the only thing that mattered, his voice, his trust, his terrified love. The contractors marched them toward the ladder. Toward whatever fate Dmitri had planned. And Leo went without resistance, because fighting would endanger CNU, and for the first time in his violent life, Leo chose his son's safety over his own pride. Above them, Seoul glittered in the pre-dawn darkness. Below them, an empire was burning. And between them, a father and son held on to each other through zip ties and terror, connected finally by words that had come 2 years too late to save them, but just in time to make their destruction mean something. I love you, Papa. CNU's voice was small and broken and perfect. I love you too, son. Leo's voice was hoarse with tears. I always have. Even when I was too much of a monster to show it. The contractors pushed them up the ladder toward captivity, toward the consequences of Leo's choices, toward an ending that would leave only blood and questions and the echo of a voice that had finally spoken, but might never speak again. Dmitri Volkov had expected many things when his contractors delivered Leo Kangde to the abandoned warehouse in Incheon. He'd expected rage, violence, negotiation. He'd expected the legendary King of Whispers to have some final card to play, some hidden leverage that would turn defeat into stalemate. What he hadn't expected was surrender. Leo sat in the metal chair, zip-tied and exhausted, with his son on his lap. The boy clung to him like a life raft, and Leo made no attempt to maintain the mask of power. He looked exactly like what he was, a defeated father who'd lost everything except the one thing he'd finally learned to value. I have a proposition, Leo said quietly. His voice lacked that whisper edge that had once preceded death. It was just a voice now. Human. Tired. You want my empire. Take it. All of it. Every territory, every operation, every asset I've built over 20 years. I'll sign whatever papers you need. I'll testify to whatever you want. I'll disappear so completely that no one will even remember I existed. Dmitri lit a cigarette, studying Leo like a chess player examining an unexpected move. In exchange for? Safe passage for my son. New identity. Protection. Enough money to ensure he never wants for anything. Leo looked down at CNU, who was watching this negotiation with those two knowing eyes. And a promise that your organization, the Red Wolves, anyone connected to this world, you leave him alone. Forever. He gets to be a normal kid with a normal life, far away from everything I've built. And you. I don't care what happens to me. Leo's voice was steady. Prison, exile, execution, whatever price you want. Just let him go. The warehouse was silent except for the distant sound of ships in the harbor. Dimitri smoked his cigarette, calculating. An empire handed over willingly. Liu Kongde's complete surrender. It was worth more than any hostile takeover, more valuable than 20 years of accumulated territory. No war, no resistance, just total capitulation. Your son speaks now, Dimitri observed. I heard him calling for you in the van. Strange. I was told he was mute. He was. To me. Leo's hand moved to CNU's hair, a gesture so tender it seemed impossible from a man who'd killed hundreds. Turns out he just needed me to stop being what I was long enough to become what he needed. Dimitri made his decision. Not because he was merciful, men like him didn't survive on mercy. But because a living Liu Kongde, stripped of power and publicly defeated, was worth more than a martyred corpse. It would send a message across the entire Asian underground. Even the untouchable could fall. Agreed, Dimitri said. But with conditions. You don't just disappear. You publicly step down. You transfer everything through legal channels where possible, make it look legitimate. You become the cautionary tale, the man who chose his son over his empire and lost both anyway. I haven't lost him. Leo looked at CNU, who was still clinging to him. Not anymore. 3 months later, Liu Kongde ceased to exist in any meaningful way. The empire was divided between Dimitri's organization and the regional partners who'd been circling like vultures. Legal authorities in 5 countries received anonymous tips about operations they'd been trying to prove for years, complete with documentation that Leo provided as part of his surrender. Dozens of men were arrested. Billions in assets were seized or redistributed. And in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Busan, far from Seoul's glittering skyline, far from the empire that had consumed his adult life, a man who'd once commanded death across continents learned how to make breakfast for his son. Eggs again? CNU asked, watching his father work at the stove with the careful attention of someone learning a completely new skill. I'm still learning the other options, Leo admitted. Tomorrow maybe we try pancakes. Miss Park made really good pancakes. Miss Park is a saint who deserved better than working for a crime lord. Leo set the plate down, slightly burned eggs, toast, orange juice. But she's safe now. New identity, new life, pension that'll keep her comfortable forever. CNU picked at his eggs. They'd been having real conversations for 3 months now, but they were still learning each other. Learning how to be father and son without the empire between them, without the silence that had protected them both from uncomfortable truths. Do you miss it? CNU asked suddenly. Being what you were? Leo sat down across from his son in their tiny kitchen that cost less than the monthly maintenance on his former penthouse. I miss the feeling of control. Of knowing I could solve any problem with money or violence or strategic thinking. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But I don't miss the person it made me. The person who thought necessary was an acceptable reason for anything. CNU looked down at his plate. I heard you. That night. After Mommy. I heard you crying in your study. I know. Dr. Brennan told me children hear everything. Leo's voice was thick. I'm sorry you had to hear that. Sorry you had to carry that knowledge alone. Were you really sad? Or were you just sad you had to do it? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Leo took a breath, forcing himself to answer honestly. Both. I loved your mother. And I killed her anyway because I was too much of a coward to choose differently. Too attached to power, too convinced that my empire mattered more than anything. I was sad because I knew I'd made a choice I couldn't take back, and it was the wrong choice. Just like almost every choice I made for 20 years. CNU absorbed this, his face serious. Miss Park said you were brave for giving it all up. Miss Park is generous. I wasn't brave. I was just finally tired of being a monster. Leo reached across the table, and CNU let him take his small hand. But I'm trying to be better. For you. Because you deserved a father who chose you first, and it took me too long to figure that out. They sat in the small kitchen, holding hands across burnt eggs and simple toast. Outside, Busan traffic hummed with normal city sounds. No armed guards. No security systems. No empire demanding attention. Just an apartment, a father and a son learning how to exist together without the weight of violence between them. Can we go to the park today? CNU asked. Normal kids go to parks. You are a normal kid. I'm the kid whose dad used to run a criminal empire and now makes terrible eggs. Leo laughed, actually laughed, a sound CNU had never heard before. Fair point. Yes, we can go to the park. Maybe get ice cream after. Very normal, very boring afternoon. I like boring. CNU squeezed his father's hand. Boring means safe. They cleaned up breakfast together, and Leo watched his son wash dishes with careful attention, and he thought about Dr. Brennan's words, love without accountability is just another form of violence. He'd spent 2 years trying to buy his son's voice with expensive gifts and specialists. It had taken losing everything, empire, power, identity, to understand that the only currency CNU needed was honesty and presence. They weren't fixed. Leo still had nightmares about the people he'd killed. CNU still flinched at loud noises, still had days where he retreated into silence as a defense mechanism. They were both carrying damage that would probably never fully heal. But they were carrying it together now, and that made it bearable. At the park, Leo pushed CNU on the swings while other fathers did the same. No one recognized him. He was just another dad, slightly awkward, trying his best. When CNU jumped off mid-swing and ran to the slide, Leo's heart seized with protective panic for just a moment before he remembered. There were no assassins here. No rival organizations. Just normal dangers that normal parents worried about. Papa, watch. CNU called from the top of the slide, and Leo watched as his son slid down wearing a smile that was pure, uncomplicated joy. The kind of joy that had been impossible in a 40-floor fortress surrounded by armed guards and weighted with inherited trauma. I'm watching, Leo called back. I'm always watching now. And he was. Not with security cameras or surveillance systems, but with the attention that fathers were supposed to give sons. The attention he'd been too busy conquering empires to provide. That night, after ice cream and a walk along the beach and dinner that was slightly less burnt than breakfast, Leo tucked CNU into bed. The boy's room was small, decorated with posters of cartoon characters Leo didn't recognize. No expensive toys. No robots that spoke 12 languages. Just normal kid things that cost normal amounts of money. Papa, CNU said as Leo turned off the light. Yes, I'm glad you chose me. Even if it meant losing everything else. Leo's throat tightened. You were always the only thing worth keeping. I just took too long to realize it. Do you think Mommy would forgive you? The question hit like a physical blow. Leo sat on the edge of the bed, his son's face barely visible in the darkness. I don't know. I don't think I deserve forgiveness. But I'm trying to become someone who might someday deserve the second chance you've given me. CNU reached out, found his father's hand. I forgive you, Papa. Not for Mommy, that's hers to forgive. But for everything else. For the silence. For making me scared. For taking so long to choose me. I forgive you. Leo broke. Quietly, not wanting to burden his son with adult tears, but the words had shattered something essential in his chest. He'd surrendered an empire, faced down death, given up everything he'd built. But this moment, his son's forgiveness offered freely in the darkness of a small bedroom in a normal apartment, was the hardest thing he'd ever faced. Thank you, he whispered. I'll spend the rest of my life earning that. Just be here, Papa. That's all I need. Just be here and make terrible eggs and take me to normal parks. That's enough. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Leo kissed his son's forehead, whispered goodnight, and closed the door softly. In the living room of their modest apartment, he sat in the darkness and thought about the journey from penthouse to here, from emperor to father, from violence to peace. He'd lost everything. Every territory, every alliance, every ounce of power he'd accumulated over decades. His name was either forgotten or used as a cautionary tale. His empire belonged to men like Dmitri now. He had nothing except this small apartment, this quiet life, and this son who'd finally learned to speak to him. And somehow, impossibly, he'd never been richer. The King of Whispers had learned a new language. Not the language of threats and violence, but the language of presence and accountability. Not the whisper that preceded death, but the quiet that allowed healing. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. But it was honest, and that honesty was the first real thing he'd built in 20 years. Outside, Busan slept. Inside, a father listened to his son breathe in the next room, marveling at the sound he'd almost lost forever. Tomorrow there would be burnt pancakes and trips to normal parks and the continued hard work of becoming someone worthy of forgiveness. But tonight, in the darkness of a small apartment that cost everything but saved everything, Liu Kangdae finally understood what power really meant. Not the ability to control others, but the courage to surrender control and let love be enough. His son was speaking. Finally, honestly, bravely speaking. And Leo was finally listening. That was the empire that mattered. The only kingdom worth ruling. And it had been there all along, waiting in the silence for him to become quiet enough to hear it. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of choices and second chances, if you believe in the possibility of redemption even for those who seem beyond saving, subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting, stories about the impossible choices people make and the humanity that survives even the darkest nights. Your subscription tells me these stories matter. That voices, even those that take years to find, deserve to be heard. Click that button. Join this community. Let's find more truth together in the quiet spaces between words. ***.